One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. This seems like kind of a sudden transition. Paul is talking about food, and he's saying, one person eats anything, one person eats only vegetables, and if you're bothered by this, then keep it to yourself. These first four verses are all about food and how one person will feel free to eat something and one person won't. And then he switches to days. And the usual interpretation of this is that he is talking about the weekly Sabbath or the new moon or the appointed times of God, like the Feast of Tabernacles and Yom Kippur and Passover. But nowhere in Romans does Paul mention any of those things. So why is he suddenly talking about days? Well, I've got some theories, and I've got my opinion on what he's talking about. And I've heard various opinions, and I think there's more or less weight on some of them. I think the idea that he's talking about the Sabbath doesn't really hold a lot of water. He's talking about eating, and then he's talking about a day, and then immediately he goes back to eating in verse 6. So it seems like this day must have something to do with eating. So the three most likely possibilities are that there are days that people observe in certain ways that are not commanded. For example, the new moon. How exactly do you determine when the month starts? Do you determine it by the conjunction of the earth, moon, and sun, like when they're all in perfect alignment? Or do you determine it by the sighting of the first sliver of the moon? Well, what about where you live versus where in Jerusalem? So scripture isn't clear. It talks about, here's how you're going to calculate the Feast of Trumpets, and here's how you're going to calculate the Feast of Passover. And it does this in relation to the month, which is what the moon means. So you have to know when the month starts, but it never tells you how to determine when the month starts. So we have various traditions. And even today, we've got different ideas. Some people say you must see two witnesses at least must see the new moon in Jerusalem before the month can officially start. Other people say, well, it counts if I see it where I live. That's good enough. And some people say, well, it counts if we can make an astronomical calculation and say, this is when the first sliver of the new moon would be visible if it wasn't cloudy or if the moon wasn't so high above the horizon or something like that. And all of those have good arguments with them. Although my opinion is that we should do whatever our local congregation does so that we can stay in unity with our fellowship. Scripture doesn't say that we have to do it that way. So if people have different opinions about how exactly to start the new month, let them do it. Doesn't hurt me, other than that there's a little bit of confusion about when God's appointed times are. So that's one thing he could be talking about. The next, last week I had also mentioned the idea of Nundinum and the Nundine, and how the Romans had different competing weeks. They had a 10-day week, an 8-day week, and a 7-day week, and they all ran at the same time. Obviously, their weeks are not all starting at the same day, because you've got one week that goes 7 days, and then another week that goes 8 days, and another week that goes 10 days. So your 7-day week is going from here to here and starting on the 8th day, which is the last day of the other week. And then the next week is starting the next day, which is the second day of the 7-day week. So it all gets very confusing. And these different weeks came from different traditions. I don't remember exactly where the 10-day week came from, but I think the 8-day week, the Romans learned from the Etruscans, and the 7-day week, they learned from the Babylonians and other Semitic peoples like the Jews. For most of Rome's history, through most of the Republic, the 8-day week was what they did. That was their official week, the predominant week. But once they had a lot of exposure to the Babylonians and Persians and Jews, the 7-day week, for whatever reason, started to take over. So that right about the time of Julius Caesar, they were about of equal popularity. And by the time of Paul, the 7-day week was almost universal in the Roman world. They were still doing the 8-day week, but almost everybody was doing the 7-day week. And the 8-day week is what really could play in here, because all the farmers would bring their crops and their animals into the markets on the 8th day. And so this was also the day that the farmers would go and make sacrifices. They'd bring their animals into the markets, sell animals to other people who would then take the opportunity to go and make sacrifices. So it was a big festival day, lots of people making sacrifices to their gods, and then the meat coming right back to the marketplace and being sold. So you would have like the 8th day and then the 1st day and maybe the 2nd day of that 8-day cycle. There would be a lot of meat sacrificed to idols in the marketplace. So it's possible that Paul is talking about this day and saying, some people are going to watch out for this day and they're not going to go to the market on those days. Some people aren't going to care. And, let each one of you be convinced in his own mind which day he should go to the market. The third possibility, the one that I think is most likely, I mean, I really like that idea of the noonday and the 8th day, because, it's interesting. It's like, ooh, that's kind of cool. But in the end, I don't really think it's the most likely explanation. I just think it's fun to talk about. The most likely explanation is that there were different fast days. The Pharisees had a tradition of fasting on the 2nd and 5th day of the week. So Monday and Thursday. Sunday's the 1st day, Monday's the 2nd. The Pharisees fasted on Monday and Thursday. And because there was a lot of conflict between the Pharisees and the early Christians, some of the early Christians started fasting on different days just so they wouldn't look like Pharisees. I've mentioned the book, The Didache, before. It's a work written in Greek sometime at the end of the 1st century, so it's very early. In chapter 8 of the Didache, he says, don't be like the hypocrites who fast on the 2nd and 5th days. You should fast on the 3rd and the 6th day. Now, exactly why? Was this just so that they wouldn't look like Pharisees, or so they wouldn't look like Jews, which would be a bad thing, because even by that time, there was a lot of division between the Jews and Gentiles. And that's why this book was written, to try to prevent that. But we can still see it happening. So Paul could be saying, one person wants to fast on this day and another person wants to fast on this other day. It doesn't really matter, because none of these days are commanded. So if you think this day is the right day, you do it to God. You honor God in fasting on that day. If you think that you should eat on that day and fast on this other day, well, give thanks to God for what he's given you, bless him, and then fast on your day. It doesn't really matter. Do whatever your conscience leads you to do. So I think those are the three most likely possibilities. And my preference is that this is talking about fasting days, because that's still related to food, and it's related to a matter of opinion that was a big controversy at this time. I think the biggest argument against the noonday idea is the very next verse. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not the next verse. It's the middle of it's the beginning of verse 5. One person esteems one day better than another, and another esteems all days alike. Well, the term esteem seems to mean to respect the day, like give it honor. If Paul is talking about the noonday, how does honor even come into this? Why would anybody honor that day? Now, maybe they're saying that they don't honor the noonday and they honor 3 days later, when there's no risk of, or at least less risk of, buying something that was sacrificed to idols. But the term esteem there makes me think that it's much more likely that he's talking about specific days that are set apart for a higher purpose, which would fit the fasting idea. Yeah, and each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. People like to say that this applies to the Sabbath, and you should be fully convinced that you should keep the Sabbath or not, and you can pick your own day to keep a Sabbath. Like if your job makes you work on Saturday, then go ahead and take Monday as your Sabbath. Or, well, now we have Sunday, the Lord's Day, and that's the new Christian Sabbath. Well, that's not in Scripture anywhere. Those are all man-made traditions. The only commandment we have concerning a Sabbath in Scripture is to keep the seventh day. And it's one of the most repeated commandments all through Scripture. So it's pretty important to God. So it seems to me that Paul calling this a matter of opinion and saying that each one should be fully convinced in his own mind whether he should keep God's commandment, that seems very unlikely to me. So that's why I don't even put that in the three possibilities.
Yes, but some people will ask, which day is the seventh day?
I have encountered several theories about that. My default is to say, what did Yeshua do? We know that Yeshua could not have done it wrong because the Sabbath is a commandment of God. And if he ever broke the Sabbath, obviously he was accused of breaking the Sabbath, but if he ever actually did break the Sabbath, then he would disqualify himself as the sacrifice for all mankind. His blood would be useless to any of us. So we know he did it right on the right day. How do we know what day Yeshua kept the Sabbath? Did he ever have an argument with anybody about how to keep the Sabbath when it was not the Sabbath? Well,
Nope.
why would he? You know, the Pharisees were always coming to him and saying, you're not doing what's allowed, or you're doing what's not allowed on the Sabbath day. And he'd be like, yeah, this is allowed. It's okay. Or to show you that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he would heal somebody or forgive their sins. How would that prove that he was Lord of the Sabbath if it wasn't even the Sabbath day? So from that, we can know without any doubt that Yeshua kept the Sabbath day on the same day that the Pharisees and Sadducees did. So how can we know what day the Pharisees and the Sadducees kept? Well, that's it. Only looking at the Bible, we can't. But we do have historical records. We have Philo of Alexandria, who wrote quite a bit. I mean, he was a Jew, and he wrote quite a bit about the commandments in the temple and the feast days. And we have Josephus, who was a Jewish priest and general, and he wrote about all these things too. Both of these men lived in the first century. And we have other like Roman histories that talk about the Jews. There was a Roman writer who said, on the seventh day of the week that we call Saturn's Day, the Jews would rest from all their labors. And so we attacked them on that day because we knew that they wouldn't fight back. And the Jews lost many battles this way because their enemies would attack their city on the Sabbath day and they would refuse to fight. So we know from history that they kept the day that the Romans called Saturn's Day as the seventh day Sabbath. So we know that Yeshua kept that day that was known as Saturn's Day as the Sabbath. So the question then becomes, is the day that we call Saturday today, is that still the day that the Romans called Saturn's Day way back then? Well, there have been some calendar changes between Yeshua's day and ours. But all of those calendar changes were only about the date and the names of the months. They never changed the days of the week. That only changed the numbers on the calendar. It didn't change the order of the days of the week. It still went from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and on to Saturday, and then on to Sunday again. And by the time of the end of the first century, all of the Roman world was keeping the same 7-day calendar. If anybody, I mean, from England all the way to Persia, they had the same week. If anybody in that sequence changed the order of the days of the week, it would have created chaos across thousands of miles in dozens of cultures. There would be records. We would know that the Persians, all of a sudden, trying to write diplomatic letters to Rome, would say, okay, why are you people talking about this other day? That's not what day it is. It's this day. The Jews, who are very strict about keeping the Sabbath, and they have been keeping the Sabbath day unbroken, we know, since the first century. Surely they would have noticed, and they would not have cooperated with Rome if Rome changed the first day to the third day and renamed Wednesday as Saturday. That would show up in historic records. There's no record of it ever happening. So we can be as certain as we can be of anything in history that the 7-day week has not been interrupted since the day of Yeshua. So the day that we call Saturday is still the seventh-day Sabbath that the Jews kept in the first century. And that's the day that Yeshua kept. So we know we're doing it on the right day.